Yeah, during our break, John decided to try to push this conversation. I'm like, let's get it on tape. Let's get this conversation going.
Well,
and we're going right now into the Jacksonville Jaguars,
the Jags,
the team that blew this division.
Well, the hardest part was Trevor Lawrence. I thought was going to have a better season than he did. He had a lot of drops by Calvin Ridley, a lot of near misses in the end zone. I don't think his receiver core completely helped him out, but I also think he didn't play to his potential. Now he better because he better play to his paycheck now, not his potential, because this man is being paid big time. So let's talk about Trevor Lawrence at the top. You can get him at value. He's one of those value guys right now in drafts. You can get Lawrence. You can get Herbert. You can get these guys down there that are going to give you a good return in terms of quarterback play. That I think if there's a year to fade the top quarterbacks based on ADP, it's this year right now, especially because the group of those guys that are there and the output they could give you can still be a top 10 performance in quarterback.
Yeah, for sure. We've done enough drafts at this point where we're seeing Lawrence go really late. Lawrence and Herbert, Aaron Rodgers, Stafford, Goff, like all these guys are down.
The rookies are going before them.
And here's the thing with those guys, right, is that their ceiling is really not there. They're giving you a decent floor, and they're giving you enough of a ceiling where you can manage games at other position. So that's the reason you go and get a Trevor Lawrence.
Well, but let me twist the argument a little bit there. Let me pull that thread.
Pull it.
Is Kirk Cousins last year, before his injury, was number 1 in yardage, or number 1 in touchdowns, number 2 in yardage in overall passing. Before his week 8 injury. So you're talking about a guy who... Hold on. You're talking about a guy with a...
To that sample, I need to destroy that argument really quick. Because to that argument, all right, Tua was number 1 at that point.
Well, he was number 1 in yardage. He was not number 1 in touchdowns.
He was number 3 in touchdowns at that point last year.
Yes, and Kirk had more fantasy points than he did.
Sure.
At that point.
But
in week 8.
Tua, my point is, Tua was number 3 and was most in passing yards, and then after week 8, just fell off the charts. So you're looking at a smaller sample size and saying, oh, he was going to sustain that number 1 quarterback position all season long.
Well, I'm not saying number 1. I'm just saying where you drafted Kirk Cousins last year, which is what we're drafting Trevor Lawrence right now, he has the opportunity to put up numbers.
He doesn't have Justin Jefferson.
No, but I'm not saying in comparison. I'm saying you're talking about you're drafting guys like this for their floor. Their floor is pretty darn high. They're not ceiling plays, but Kirk Cousins had some ceiling games.
Well, yeah.
So I'm just saying.
What I'm saying is like their ceiling. There might be one of those guys in that batch, and here's really the Trevor Lawrence debate argument I want to have is, let's take a group of that guys. All right, let's take the Stafford.
Let's say Stafford,
Rodgers, Cousins,
Goff, and Lawrence.
And Lawrence, who you taking? Like, Lawrence is not appealing to me out of any of those guys. I'd probably take him last out of all of them.
I wouldn't take him last out of all of them.
Who would you take below him?
Cousins, because I just don't know about it after injury. That's the only thing that scares me about Cousins.
I'm okay.
And he's not throwing to Jefferson.
No, I'm okay with that.
But I could argue Rodgers because of the running game. I'm not a Jets fan, but I could argue Rodgers. But I agree. I mean, I'd rather have Goff.
But yeah, I mean, you have the same running game in ETN.
Kind of.
You do with Brees.
Kind of.
I mean, like, again, and Stafford with
Stafford. We've seen what they could do with those two guys when healthy. So
my argument here is like there's not, for me, with Trevor Lawrence, he's milquetoast.
Which is funny for a number 1 overall pick.
But from a fantasy perspective,
yeah,
like,
I agree.
As a franchise quarterback, yeah, like he's decent enough. Like he gives you a decent enough floor. He can keep you in games. He's not going to lose games. I mean, maybe not lose you games, but there's, from a fantasy perspective, I really don't. There's nothing that's attractive to him other than like the weapons that he has around him. But who do you like?
That keep changing.
Well, who do you like more around? Like, again, let's take Stafford and Rodgers and him, because I actually think Lawrence has better weapons than Cousins does.
He does.
But let's take Stafford. Let's throw Goff into this mix. Goff, Stafford, Rodgers, and then
Lawrence.
Lawrence, I think, has the worst weapons out of all those guys in terms of receiving.
I mean, it's hard to say that because for Stafford, he's got 2 wide receivers. And then
but they're both 1A.
Yeah, but I'm saying that's all he's got. When you talk about Rodgers, he's got a running back out the backfield. He's got Garrett Wilson, and then he's got some question marks who's going to be wide receiver 2, if Williams is going to be healthy enough or not. When you look at Lawrence, you have one of the best slot receivers in the game in Christian Kirk. You get Gabe Davis, who we saw what he can do in Buffalo. And then you have ETN as well. Like, I think he's right on par with those other 2 guys, arguably.
The question marks that we're having, the question marks that you're having with Gabe Davis, I think you can make the same thing with Mike Williams.
But I don't have question marks with Gabe Davis.
I do.
I don't. I just think I think that whole offense in Buffalo was inconsistent. I mean, you saw there was not enough mouths to feed with Stefan's big mouth. That's the problem. And when Stefan didn't get fed, Gabe Davis had big games. When Stefan got fed, Gabe Davis faded away. So I think that's what you got to look at there. I think there's a lot more to pass around here because Evan Ingram is the other one I didn't mention, who, again, we'll talk about him shortly, but hyper-targeted tight end, one of the top targeted tight end last year. He still put up massive numbers for this team and in 2 consecutive seasons with this offense.
Yes, I mean, this is the thing where I don't see the upside appeal of Lawrence over those other guys. And maybe, again, it's a bias with, like, it's the devil I know versus the devil I don't. I really haven't loved Lawrence since he's come into the league as a fantasy quarterback. And it's really not if he's going to be a backup that I get, sure. But, like, where he's going in our the drafts is around those kind of guys. Like, is he throwing up monster numbers where he's finishing as a top 10 quarterback?
He finished top 8 the season before. He was 13 last year, 8 the season before. But this is why I like him over those other guys. Or, like, you could argue him over those other guys. The dude's rushing an average of probably 68 to 70 rushes a season. You're not getting that out of Rodgers.
No.
You're not getting that out of Stafford.
No.
And you're not getting that out of Goff.
No.
And
you're getting touchdowns.
Well, you are getting touchdowns, but he's also averaging about 4 touchdowns a season, rushing, and over 4.5 yards per carry. So, like, to me, at the end of the day, like, he's a rushing quarterback, quote unquote, not quite like your big time guys, but he adds that edge and that value to that total. Because he's only thrown for 17 in a season as his most.
Fine, let's take those guys out and let's put a comparable guy with him because he's fallen in drafts too. Justin Herbert or Trevor Lawrence.
Oh, I like Herbert more.
Okay,
but Herbert.
So you're going to have an opportunity at those guys.
But Herbert finished behind the past 2 seasons.
Herbert's been hurt the last 2 seasons too.
No, he wasn't hurt. He was only hurt last year. The season before, he finished behind.
Okay.
And Herbert hasn't rushed for over 63 rushes in a season. So he's not topping out over 70 in rushes. And his rushing ability is not that of Trevor Lawrence's. Like, I mean, we watched Trevor Lawrence in college.
Yeah, he's a mobile enough quarterback. He's not a mobile quarterback, but he's mobile enough.
I wouldn't call him mobile enough. I would call him mobile-ish. Because he's more mobile than mobile enough because Herbert's mobile enough.
He's being drafted in kind of the 10 to 15 range of quarterbacks off the board. So are you probably even late?
Our last mock draft, he was drafted after Tua, after Purdy.
Right.
After Herbert.
I would take all those guys over him.
Yeah, I would too. I'm saying those guys I would take over.
Love and Dak and I mean obviously all the top guys that we don't even need to talk about, but like I'm taking all those guys over him.
So judging by this conversation, we can move on to the running back spot.
We can move on to the running back.
But you're just avoiding Lawrence. Period.
I'm avoiding Lawrence.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's better, and it's not that I hate him. It's that I think that there's better options for where you kind of have to take him or where he's falling to. I'd rather wait another round and get one of the other guys. Like I don't think that there's that big of a drop off.
Here's the question. I think this is a bigger one. Him or Deshaun Watson?
Deshaun Watson.
Yep, me too. I'm with that too. Sean Watson is a limited sample size, had like 27 carries last year.
Yeah.
So let's move on to Travis Etienne. They did not add anybody really to this backfield worth contending with him. This is Etienne's backfield. He had a fantastic season last year. People who drafted him higher on their boards were lucky enough to get a great running back. If he fell in your drafts and you got him, you were lucky enough to get a great running back. I mean, the whispers that they are out there that they want to reduce his touches a little bit to try and keep him a little bit. They always say that to these guys.
Everyone
they said the same
does
thing. They said that about McCaffrey this year. They said about McCaffrey in the past too as well. And when push comes to shove, you got to win a ball game. You're giving the ball to your best player. Do I think Tank Bigsby has a little bit of a role this year? I think he was a little bit of a doghouse last year. His fumbling problems were there. He wasn't polished. He probably didn't have great pass protection. And so I think if he got better in any single way, which I've heard kind of a black and white of it all here. I've heard, no, he's not. He doesn't look that great. And then I've heard, oh, he looks improved. So I don't know what to trust there, which is why I'm steering clear of him. But Etienne is a guy I want to try and draft in all my leagues.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it, like the one thing I would have done differently in
my last draft. If you haven't watched that mock draft, go ahead, watch the mock draft. We'll link that for you here.
It was pretty exciting. John and I did the same thing through the first 6 rounds.
7 rounds.
7 rounds?
7 rounds.
But we ended up with completely different teams. He drafted first. I drafted 10th. Well, we looked very, very similar. The one thing I would have done differently is in the 3rd round, he started off the draft from the first overall position and went McCaffrey, Devon Achane, and then on the swing round could have went Etienne, and I would have went Etienne there instead of going Nico Collins.
Well, so Etienne was what I would have normally done there. But in terms of mocks, I wanted to see what it was like to get an upside in Achane. And the more I'm thinking about it, when you said that in a real draft, I'd probably go Etienne there instead of Nico.
What you can do from that position is like, and that's where I really do see Etienne going, is kind of the tail end of the 2nd round into the 3rd round. And I've seen Derrick Henry fall into the back end of the 2nd round. I think that's going to start shifting up a little bit further. Etienne might start coming up a little bit more. I like Etienne this year. I think he is the Jaguar that I'm most excited to try to get on my team.
Yeah, I want him. I want Kirk, and I
like Brian Robinson,
and I want Ingram. Brian Thomas. Yeah, we'll talk about him in a second. He's probably the one I'm most excited about because of where you can get him and the potential he brings you.
Yeah.
And from what I've heard and seen so far in camp. But I agree with you. Etienne is one of those ones that if you fade that 1st round running back, or you don't get the one you want in the 1st round, you get him in the 2nd round. He's a perfect RB1.
He's an RB1.
He could finish top 5 in fantasy.
He's an RB1. If you're in the top 4 picks and you're going to go wide receiver, Etienne should be a guy you're targeting in the second.
PPR is a perfect example. PPR league where you're going for these top wide receivers here, and you fade McCaffrey or arguably everybody's putting Bijan or Saquon right there, but Bijan, you go wide receiver, you get Jay Jettas, you get Tyreek, whatever it may be, you get Etienne in that 2nd round, you're going to be happy. You'll be very happy.
And I agree with you. I don't think that there's I don't have a lot of faith in Tank Bigsby. I don't really have a lot of faith in Dearness Johnson. Both those guys are going to require Etienne to get injured to really have a significant fantasy impact. I think both those guys, if anything, one of those two are going to emerge as being more of a goal line guy. We thought that Etienne was going to take a step back from that. He ended up being really efficient on the goal line.
Yeah, very good in the goal line.
And so I think he's not going to lose a ton of that. But if he did, and he loses some of the short yardage, it's going to be one of those two guys. I just don't know who it's going to be, and do I really value either one of them enough to put like a round value on them?
No.
I'd rather go and pick them up.
They're a waiver wire pickup or free agency pickup. In my opinion, I think Dearness Johnson takes the early down work, or the late down, or some 3rd down game as well. Short yardage. I think Tank Bigsby is the ultimate short yardage guy for that team there.
Yeah.
So,
but I do want to spend some time talking about I think the most interesting part of this team, which is the wide receiver core, between Christian Kirk, Brian Thomas, and Gabe Davis. They have 3 legit guys.
This is what I'm arguing about Trevor Lawrence here. Like, I think the opportunities are there.
I understand that, but even within this division, that
That's to me
they're
that's
the third best.
Well, it's the best trio in my opinion. Trio.
Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell.
Oh, in the division. I thought we were talking about that. Sorry, the quarterbacks we were breaking down earlier. I think the best trio, the quarterbacks were breaking down. No,
in the division.
Houston's got the best trio.
And even D-Hop,
and you can
Calvin Ridley, and Tyler Boyd.
I think they're right. I think they're right on par with those two.
I mean, we haven't seen Brian. I mean, I know all the reports of Brian Thomas is
fantastic.
Is fantastic, but we haven't seen it yet, right? And there's big questions there. And Gabe Davis hasn't been consistent enough yet.
I presented my argument of why.
I understand that, but it's still numbers are numbers, right?
No, you put up or shut up. I mean, here's the thing. You know what you're getting out of Christian Kirk. He is probably one of the safest picks in fantasy drafts because he is
PPR. He's a freaking monster.
But even in non-PPR, he's still so good at what he does out of the slot. And Ridley was a big end zone target last year. I think Brian Thomas eats into that a little bit, but I think Kirk bounces himself back up a little bit.
Let me say this, and this is probably one of the best predictors of a good fantasy season is receptions, right?
Yeah, it's volume.
It's volume, right? We've always talked about it on this channel. Is volume is king, and Christian Kirk, year after year, gets volume from the slot. He is 100-yard reception or 100 reception guy from the slot, and he runs the highest slot rate of any wide receiver
in the league.
He is there, and he's productive out of that. So it's a guy you absolutely have to love. Now you add a physical, big body receiver,
true wideout
on the other side, and a vertical deep threat on the other side. Like, I do think that there's some potential for Trevor Lawrence here, but it's all reliant on like what pans out with those guys, and there's enough question marks with me that like I like Christian Kirk. I drafted him in our last mock draft. I really loved him there. I have a lot of shares of him in best ball.
Me too.
Gabe Davis I don't have a lot of, but Brian Thomas is a guy that I wanted to draft in every one of my best balls, and I think I only have him on one team because every time I'm sitting there ready to draft him, he's taken like a couple picks before me because I keep waiting on him, and he's not there yet. And these are the question marks with Trevor Lawrence. Is like he's not there for me yet because I have those question marks to where I'm like I need to reach 2 rounds ahead to make sure I get him.
See, but here's the thing about and I think. I'm not drafting Gabe Davis that often, and it's not that I don't trust Gabe Davis, but I think when you
it is though.
No, it's not that I don't trust Gabe Davis. What I trust Brian Thomas Jr. more. I trust that the fact when push comes to shove, by middle of the season at the least, Brian Thomas is the outside man in the 1-2 receivers with Christian Kirk. And then you have Evan Ingram who can also go wider in the slot, and they're running back. So I think that pushes Gabe Davis to wide receiver 3 as the second outside guy.
I agree with you there. I do think that's kind of...
Or they eat into each other's time. But I think that's not the question mark. The question mark's at the snap percentage. It's not at the talent.
And I think Brian Thomas is a better red zone threat than Calvin Ridley was. I think he's going to fit into that role a little bit better because it's not... And this is where we talked about Brian Thomas. Is like he was a good route runner. He's a physical receiver. So he's a bigger body to go up and be a red zone target than Calvin Ridley was, which is where Calvin Ridley really didn't have a great season last year. He could have had a better season last year if he caught more red zone.
Got 2 feet targets. In. We talked about all that.
We already talked about it. But Brian Thomas can do that, and that's where I think he fits into this role a little bit better. And I absolutely like him. To try to target, I just haven't been able to. Like he's one of those guys where he's in the mid round, like the later mid rounds, and like it's so hard to predict because
this is where you do your homework, people. This is where you look and see what the ADP is, and if you want Brian Thomas Jr. team, which
you're gonna have to reach on.
It's not that you have to reach on him, but you're gonna know that like, hey, I'm not drafting anybody in this round. The round early before, I'm going to take him the round before, knowing that I'm going to miss on these people.
But that's what I'm saying. You're going to have to reach on him because I think that there are a lot of people in that same position that really like Brian Thomas, and they're going to try to reach for him.
Yeah.
And that's where I was like, if you really like him, you're going to have to reach for him because there's going to be someone in your 12-team league that is willing to do that. Whether it's 1 round or 2 rounds early, you're going to have, and that's where I've constantly found myself in best ball, That's why I only have him on one of my teams, is because I'm like, I love this guy. And then I'm like, I'm getting ready to draft him because this is where his value is. And then like 2 rounds before that, he's gone.
Well,
and it's like, I wasn't ready to pull the trigger on him. But if you like him that much, you should, because I do think his value is there. And like, I did a lot of the earlier drafts where I'm like, damn it. Like he might be, outside of Marvin Harrison, I think he might be the best rookie wide receiver this year.
In terms of output in fantasy,
or in
terms
output,
of
I think
just
Neighbors is right there too, because there's no
one else.
There's no one else. And that's where I think.
But that's the argument for Harrison too. There's really no one else.
But like, Dunze's off the board.
I think you don't think Keon Coleman's going to put out what you think?
I do, but I think Brian Thomas is right there.
Yeah.
And I think that,
trust me, in our dynasty draft, our rookie draft,
right,
I wanted Coleman. I think we both agreed on Coleman, but I was really secretly hoping Brian Thomas would fall to us in that case.
But he didn't.
But he didn't. But I still like Roman Wilson a lot. We got him.
Yeah. I don't like him as much. We'll get into the AFC North later on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is a guy, like, this wide receiver core is going to be interesting because there's a lot of shaked up parts. Christian Kirk is really the only solid guy coming back, so it's really on who is going to emerge as kind of the outside threat that's going to be the getting the every down work there. Is it going to be Gabe Davis? Is it going to be Brian Thomas? And then what's the red zone targets going to look like? Judging by what we've seen from Gabe Davis in the past, I can assume that it's going to be more Brian Thomas because Gabe Davis is more of a downfield threat than a red zone. But we've seen some red zone targets from him before.
Yeah.
I want to move on to talking about the tight end because I think Evan Ingram is a really interesting guy because he did lead the league last year in targets from a tight end position. However, his receptions just didn't add up.
But again, it goes across the board. It could be a Trevor Lawrence problem because it was a problem with Ridley. It was a problem with Evan Ingram. So, I don't have the stats in front of me to look up what Christian Kirk's like targets versus receptions were. But like, are they on the same par? Are they all on par? And then if that case, then that is a Trevor Lawrence issue.
And this is the issue that I have with Ingram. I think Ingram. This is where I stand on Ingram. Ingram is the last of the top tier tight ends.
Yes,
he is the very end of it. Like, you go Kels and Laporta and McBride and Andrews and Kittle, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, and then Ingram, and I think that's the end of it. And I think everyone else kind of falls into a category outside of that. And I think that there's two. You could break it up and saying there's 2 categories within that 6 people or 7 people that I listed off. But Ingram, he's really interesting because the target share is there, but the output is just not. Like, we don't see it from the touchdown perspective. We don't see it from the reception and the yardage perspective, but the work is there.
Well, he had 143 targets. He only caught, I think, 114 for maybe 930, 940. So, like, he still caught over 100 balls. Like, he was the number 2 tight end in fantasy, both PPR and standard. The touchdowns are not there. Like, that's a tough part for him. He only had 4. But, I mean, you look at Ridley and Ridley's output. Ridley had massive target share. He had less than Ingram. He had 136 targets, but he only had 76 receptions. That was the biggest disparity for Ridley. 76 on that, and still had 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
So this is where ADOT comes into play for Ingram versus Ridley and all that. But we get that because Ingram plays a lot out of the slot at times. He plays a lot out wide, a lot of underneath stuff. I looked at Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk took the biggest hit to Calvin Ridley being there, which is why I like Kirk a little bit more this year. Kirk, I believe, only had something like 85 targets, but he only had 57 receptions. But still had over 11 yards per reception there too as well. So I like Ingram a lot. Like, he is the last of that top bunch because of what he can do with his targets. I don't think his targets get impacted by Gabe Davis or Brian Thomas because it was proven that his targets didn't get impacted by Calvin Ridley. Whose targets got impacted? It was Christian Kirk, but that was because they hyper-targeted Calvin Ridley for some reason, and I don't get it. But I'm drafting Evan Ingram any chance I can if I want a piece of that top tier. Now, again, as I always say, I'm not throwing caution to the wind. I'm taking Ingram if I'm ready to take a tight end. and if somebody hasn't slipped to me or if there's not value around him. But if there's better value around him, I'm willing to fade Ingram because I'm not. Yes, he was the number 2 tight end, but on a week-to-week basis, there were other tight ends that were better than him overall.
Right, like could you do a combination of 2 other guys and still end up with better standard? He was 6.
Sorry, 6.
I was like, there's no way he was the number 2 tight end. In PPR he was, but there's no way in standard he was with only 4 touchdowns. Like any of those guys, like I feel this season is a season that like I'm not afraid to go and take a tight end early, depending on what else is there. But you can go and get a good tight end in the 5th or 6th round, and Ingram is kind of right around that range with it's like 6th, 7th round. For me, like I think when I haven't gone, it kills kind of my cutoff. If I haven't gone Kittle or above, I fade until Njoku, Musgrave, Freiermuth.
Yeah, I mean, to me,
Njoku.
To me, yeah, because the value of those other tight ends and the output you're going to get from them aren't there. But that's why I stick to Ingram if I can get him. I mean, we don't have to hammer that point home.
Right.
But like there's a drop off in terms of consistency and confidence in the tight end position after Ingram.
Yeah, I mean,
I should say volume.
Where you're drafting him, depending on what the rest of your team looks like. If you have a quarterback in those first picks before him, then what's the value at running back and wide receiver look like that you're going to go and take Ingram right there?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
No, exactly. Well, that goes back to our draft, which we'll have an episode coming closer to draft season on our draft strategies, what we tend to like to do, and what you could do in different. And then one of those things is obviously trying to not take quarterback and tight end both together within the first 4 or 5 rounds.
Yeah.
It handcuffs you a little bit.
It does.
But anyway, we'll take a quick break and we'll come back with the Houston Texans, the final team from this division.
Final team from AFC South.